and welcome to anyone who's joining us. I'm Phoebe. I'm with my wonderful friend and collaborator, Daniel, and we're going to be talking this morning about the Shakespeare Authorship Question and Oxfordianism. The reason I wanted to do this video is oftentimes I have friends who know that I'm really into this, and it's helpful to just be able to refer people to like a simple, accessible, not too crazy video that's just the main points, laying out the argument for the Shakespeare Authorship Question and why people like Mark Twain and Freud and Vladimir Nabokov and Orson Welles and Malcolm X and C.S. Lewis and Robin Williams and Keanu Reeves and many others have been really taken by this. So that's our goal for the day. And I hope we'll be able to at least, raise some questions for people and lay out a relatively straightforward case. So Daniel, how did you start getting interested in the Shakespeare Authorship Question? How did you get involved in Conspiracies?
Before I had even thought to look into the authorship case, I got more into standard Stratfordian biographies. And I had seen some things online saying Edward de Vere was the author behind the plays. So, I downloaded an audiobook on it. Things did start to make sense. Like, it was kind of a revelation. I wouldn't say I'm totally decided. It's a complicated question. There's a lot of writers at the time. There's a lot of pen names at the time. And even once you get into these alternative theories that say that Shakespeare was either not involved or minimally involved, there's people that disagree past that. So there's a lot to work out. Yeah. So it's been about a year of researching this subject. Yourself, how did you get into this issue?
Yeah, I mean, I honestly, I fell into it. I encountered a really beautiful show by Hank Whittemore, where he's laying out the monument theory case, which we're not going to touch on today. But when you talk about the revelation, like, it lit a fire. Like, these have been some of like the most joyful days of my life. I love researching it. It's so wonderful.
Like, I'd come across the theories of Francis Bacon before, and that never really sat that well with me. So I had always assumed if there was an authorship case, Francis Bacon would be the main one. It would just never really interested me. The de Vere one is when I started to see like circumstantial evidence starts to pile up really quickly.
Totally. So let's talk a little bit about why is it that people think that the Stratford man, Will of Shakespeare, Stratford, whatever, why is he not necessarily like a bullseye? Why is the shoe not fitting? I'll start off with, he owned no books. There's almost no evidence that he was even literate. So whoever wrote these plays, A, was fluent in multiple foreign languages, and B, was reading and had access to works that we know definitively were not yet translated into English. So the fact that like Will of Stratford owned no books, like his will, he showed no books, like all that we have, there's not a single letter. We have signatures, but if you look at them, there are forensics handwriting experts who've suggested that, in fact, they're written by different people. And there's the argument that he's asking other people to sign his signature on his behalf. It just doesn't seem like he was literate. That's a big one for me.
Yeah. There's so many absences around him. I think this is what got people interested in looking into whether this man wrote the plays or not. Looking into like the literary evidence of the time, there's giant absences around Shakespeare. So many of the figures at the time, they're not only writing to each other, they're writing about each other, and they're publishing poems to each other. There is references to Shakespeare during both de Vere's life and Shakespeare's life, but they're talking about the Shakespeare publications. That's like basing a biography on a book review. People read the book and they were talking about the book. They're not writing in a diary that like I met with him, and they are about other people. I just feel there is these giant absences around Shakespeare's life.
Totally. I just want to pick up on a couple of things that you were saying. One of which is like, I love Alexander Waugh. Like, it's really stuck in his craw. Like, he fucking hates the Stratford people. And he's always writing about how it's like, I think even from like the 1700s is when this like tourist industry kind of sprung up. And it's funny if you read the history where it's like, there was like Stratford upon Avon. And so they show up and they're looking for a tourist attraction. And so people are like happy to supply it. And so one guy, I think, has like a tree and he's like, oh, this was like Shakespeare's tree. And then he starts carving spoons out of the tree and selling people spoons that are like Shakespeare souvenir spoons. So this is like people hustling in the 1700s. So you have to like respect the game, but at the same time, it's like Alexander Waugh writes about like the modern day. Oh, this is where he grew up. This is where he was living. And it's all kind of shoddy in terms of how it's historically backed up. The other thing I wanted to touch on was when you're talking about the aristocratic perspective that sort of makes you smell a rat, but also the fact that he's literally specifically referencing different marriage plots that are happening in the court with Queen Elizabeth, court gossip, things that people who are not in the world of politics, really highly placed, would not have had access to, like literally talking about the affairs of the day in a way that even like I was listening to an interview with a Stratfordian, they were being asked, well, so how do you account for the fact that guy who was probably like a teenager at the time living in Stratford upon Avon, like why is it that he's making this like spicy commentary on like who's trying to marry Queen Elizabeth? And like their response was like, he, found like a previous author's work and he didn't know what he was adapting. And it doesn't really hang together, even not just from his aristocratic perspective, but also literally not knowing what's going on in court news.
Especially the marriage plots, because by the time that we have Shakespeare publications, Elizabeth was in the last decade of her life. There was no more marriage plots during that time. It does feel to me like I'm not an absolute expert on all the Shakespeare plays, but a lot of it seems like there are commentaries on political activity that's happening in the 1570s and the 1580s.
Yeah.
Which, I mean, you can write plays right now about political stuff that's happening in the 90s or, the early aughts. It can happen, but it's
like looking at an episode of SNL that's about like George Bush and being like, oh, see, he's talking about Barack Obama. And you're like, it just doesn't really line up. It's misdated. Also, I also want to talk about travels and how de Vere, so I guess he was obsessed with Italy. He was known as the Italianate Englishman, and he went on this very well-documented journey to Italy, to Venice, and he was touring all around. And so I think there's an extremely high correlation between the places that he lived when he was there. And for example, in Venus and Adonis, he's describing the Sala de Troia. It's a long monologue where, I messed it up. It's in The Rape of Lucrece, right? Where she's looking at a mural. She's describing this painting that she's looking at, which is in a palace that de Vere would have gone to. And literally it's like a long sequence in which it's like, you couldn't just generate this. Yeah.
It's actually more revealing even than that, because the two artists that come up there are Titian. At the same time, another artist at the time was Giulio Romano, who is in that same area. I think it's Mantua. So if de Vere's an aristocrat, he's moving through Italy. He has papers from ambassadors in France that are announcing him. He's not staying in hotels. He's not staying above inns. He's staying with aristocrats as they go. That's how you travel when you're an earl. And de Vere was not only an earl, but I think he was, for most of his life, the second highest ranking in the English.
It's the second oldest title. So, he had this real sense of gravitas around his, noble lineage. And I think he was deeply patriotic. He felt deeply called to, bring the Renaissance to English arts and letters. And so at the time that he's living, people think of English as this kind of barroom language. It's doggerel. It's not sophisticated. Anybody who's educated is speaking in French or you're reading in Latin. And so he's traveling around the world and he goes to Italy and he's seeing all this incredible Commedia dell'arte and this wonderful theater and arts and music. And he's like, we got to up it. It's like, as on my patriotic duty as an Englishman to like raise the game. And so I just think about it. It's like they went from worst to first, now it's like England is known as the premier center for belle arts and letters. And it's amazing. His legacy has endured. I think we're speaking English today, largely due to his legacy.
Mm-hmm. As he moves through France and as he moves through Italy, I think he's absorbing basically the Renaissance and bringing a lot of it back to England. But just getting back to that Giulio Romano, it's an interesting issue because, no, it's fine. There was tons of Giulio Romano paintings in the house of the aristocrat. I think it was his last name was Gonzaga. Some of them are about the Roman story of Tarquin's rape of Lucrece. They match the rape of Lucrece verses very well. De Vere sponsors a lot of translations in his life. And one of the main ones was a Latin translation of Castiglione's The Courtier, which I think The Courtier set a lot of his philosophy for his life. And Castiglione's grave is near Titian's studio and where Romano was working. I believe the sculpture of Castiglione's wife was carved by Giulio Romano. So it doesn't prove anything, but it's another circumstantial link. And they just start connecting more and more to the plays in ways that you wouldn't expect.
I guess I want to make it clear to anyone who's listening that I think that evidence for de Vere, it's like this death by 1,000 cuts thing. It's just it just starts to pile up. And so it's like, for me, it's almost like you get this outline, like it sort of like gradually emerges. And I would say, so there's two questions and we're not really going to go into the second one today. There's who wrote the works and then why is it not public knowledge. And so I think that we're not really going to touch on this today, but without going into too much detail, I would say that I think we can say pretty conclusively that part of why his name is sort of buried to history relates to him kind of being on the wrong side of the succession debate. So Queen Elizabeth dies. She hasn't named an heir. No one knows who's going to be, on the throne next. Basically, he backs the wrong guy and his guy does not end up on the throne. And as a result, his legacy is kind of attacked. So that's just to give people a taste of why it's not just that, his name was lost to history. I think there was a combination of him working behind the scenes and using pseudonyms and his noble station and not wanting to, be known for this because it was seen as unseemly at the time. And then also a pretty intentional effort to kind of wipe him out after his guy loses.
Yeah, I'm still kind of researching that area, but definitely why that pen, if it is a pen name, why that pen name comes out in the last decade of Elizabeth's life as she's getting, and they don't know that's the last decade of her life. They just know that she's getting very old.
Yeah.
Also too, why those two poems, those two first poems that we ever see, Venus and Adonis and Rape of Lucrece, why they came out at that time. And yeah, like you had said, a lot of the sonnets, they're kind of mysterious as to why they were written. I mean, the sonnets are notoriously confusing as to who they're talking about and why they were written. I think as you start to line them up in De Vere's life, they make sense why they came out at that time. So I do think there's a lot that can be revealed by looking at Shakespeare in light of the succession of Elizabeth.
Well put.
Yeah.
So we're talking about this De Vere guy. I like to think about him. I always say he's almost like a Kanye West type of personality, because I think it helps people to understand why he would have run into some trouble politically throughout his life. He was a guy who was just really bombastic and filled with life and energy and intensity and vigor, and was kind of excited and interested in everything, and also really had a tendency to like put his foot in his mouth and piss people off. He could be really nasty and impulsive, and he was the kind of guy who would literally give you a house. Like if you needed money, he would say, here, I'm going to sign you like my house in your name. And then when he ran out of money, as you do when you're literally spending like the equivalent of like millions of dollars on clothes and art and compulsively spending, and then he literally, his friends would go to debtor's jail because he would say, oh yeah, like I can't afford to like pay the carpenter to like fix the doorknob on this house, would you mind? And then like friend who's like not a nobleman ends up going to jail for him, and he can be really nasty too. So he's a controversial figure. There's so many moments, I don't know, I love this moment when people are denouncing him because he gets into trouble and they're saying, oh yeah, he's such an asshole, he's such a heretic. He was saying he used to get drunk and he would say, I could write a better Bible with 6 days warning. And I love that so much. And I'm like, oh my God, it's like, that's like 25-year-old Shakespeare, like edgelording, like bragging about how cool he is, like trying to be kind of heretical. And I feel like his personality is so vivid. He was really generous. He was a showman. I love this story where basically he pisses off Queen Elizabeth again. And so he needs to kind of like apologize to her and get back in his good graces. So he does, he's going through all these jousting tournaments. So he does this show at this jousting tournament where it's like the night of the night of the tree of the sun. And so she's this tree of the sun and he's this knight and he's apologizing. Anyway, he shows up hours early to like hide in this tent so that everyone can show up and file in. And then he can like make this amazing entrance like from this tent. And then he does this like incredible routine where he's the knight of the tree of the sun, and people go so crazy for it that they rip up the tent for souvenirs and people are just like losing it. So he was a guy who could put on a show. He was a guy who was volatile. He was a guy who was not good with money.
Yeah, like a showman. And also he knew his audience. And I know you just watched Love's Labour's Lost, which to us, it's a confusing play. It seems like it doesn't make a lot of sense. When you start to research who they're referencing, I think his audience is that for that play, especially probably a courtly audience. I think their minds would have been on fire with trying to figure out who's he talking about, what is this episode referencing, and in many different ways, in England, in the international scene, in the literary disputes of the time, things that can look to us a little confusing, a little boring. I think to his audience would have been like, these are the people we know, the people who have visited the court, and making these allusions. This
is maybe not exactly what you're saying, but it's almost like these courtly revels. So, a lot of the comedies, people get confused because they show up dated earlier. And so sometimes people think, oh, Will of Stratford we know that there was like a play that was called like King Lear, Leir, like the tragedy of. And so people think that, oh, he was just adapting all these works and updating them. But in fact, I think it's pretty clear that he was writing these things throughout his life. He would edit them. He would write something that was sort of like a courtly revel. So like, I think of it as like a skit, like when you were, I don't know, like in high school, when you would have like an assembly with school, and then people would put on a skit, like making fun of the principal, making fun of the science teacher, making fun of whatever school you guys were going to play in, basketball next week. Like that's sort of like all these kind of insidey jokes. And so a lot of those have been retained in the versions of the plays that we have today. And so it's like, again, another reason why having an Oxfordian lens really helps you understand the works more is like, there's so many things that I remember when I was in school and I was reading like a Shakespeare play, and there'd be some word or phrase and you're like, what does this mean? And it would look at it and it would say what it meant, but it wouldn't be any more clarifying at all. You're like, why is he talking about that? What? And so a lot of these things are these inside jokes referring to the politics and the personae of the times.
Which, I mean, this takes some careful, like, literary analysis to go through every play, but some of that, it seems obvious that the person who's writing the play is in the know. I mean, I think from a standard view, you're going to say that William Shakespeare, he's writing for aristocrats, but I don't know. It's some of this stuff is coming from like a decade or two earlier. It seems like someone with inside knowledge writing for people with inside knowledge. Some of these plays, I think some of the plays maybe were written for a wider popular audience, but then some of these plays, it definitely seems like this thing would have hit best in like 1580 when,
I know, I feel like, I feel like it would kill him today if he saw that like a lot of these revivals and productions are being put on that don't trim down the stuff that just doesn't make sense to people. Like, I feel like he was not a snob or an elitist when it came to like people. He wanted people to go crazy and love his plays. Like, I feel like it's like dishonoring him to not like make it so that it's going to be accessible to the audience.
Do you want to talk a little bit about Shakespeare and Education?
Oh, yeah, sure. Do you want to talk about it?
Well, I mean, this is one of the main issues. Could these plays have been written by someone who did not have a university education? The standard Stratfordian view is that he had a grammar school education. There's no records from the Stratford Grammar School that he attended.
Right.
The argument is that he would have attended because his father was bailiff at the time, which allowed him to have free admission to the school.
There's a couple of problems with that. I love this amazing Mark Twain quote in his book, Is Shakespeare Dead?
Yeah.
Which is amazing and highly recommended. He's talking about how in this like natural history museum, they just built this huge brontosaurus, and everyone's like, wow, this big brontosaurus, but it's actually like, there's only like 6 bones and then like 99 barrels of plaster.
Yeah.
And so he's basically drawing a comparison between Shakespeare's biography and saying that it's like, there's 6 bones, like there's 6 little things that we can actually confirm. And the rest of it, we've built this amazing dinosaur, but it's all basically like made up BS, or people
Mostly
who are starting
plastic.
from the premise, starting from the premise that he wrote the plays and then trying to like retcon, figuring out how that could possibly work, as opposed to actually interrogating or investigating the evidence honestly. So anyway, so you were saying with regards to education, talk to me about grammar school.
First of all, we don't know that he went to the grammar school. There's no record of it. Again, like you said, we're reading back because he wrote the plays. He would have had to have done that. I think the standard explanation is that Shakespeare got a good grounding in Latin at this grammar school, but his father was bailiff of Stratford around that time. So the argument is that he would have had, why not send him there? Because of your position, you would have had free tuition to go there. There's people that argue back and forth that, well, his father looked like he was in the glove making business, in the wool trading business.
Yeah, he was jumping around.
Why?
And also, I think he was the oldest son, right? So it's like, it would have been weird for him to send his oldest son to school. He would be an apprentice. That would be more typical.
And there was actually a lot of children there to feed at the time. So would he have sent? But okay, either way, let's say he did go to the grammar school. At the time, a lot of the playwrights from the 1580s, they're coming straight from university. And a lot of the theatrical life of the time is coming from the universities. Like when Elizabeth goes and visits the university, they put on plays. Also, one of the major playwright sources of plays at the time is the law schools, which it strikes us, I think, as a bit weird. But Figures of the time, like Francis Bacon or Philip Sidney, they all went for finishing school at law schools and they put on plays there. Lots of times nobles would come and visit to watch the plays. Like,
Right.
it was a thing that student troops would do.
Right.
So for Shakespeare not having gone to university, again, I think this doesn't prove anything, but it's another gap there. It's another thing there's something a little bit odd about this story. I think there are playwrights at the time, like Ben Jonson. I believe he was from the country.
He was a bricklayer. Yeah, he worked as a bricklayer.
He had sort of a humble background, although his father, I believe, was a clergyman. So there was, he wasn't coming from an illiterate family. Right. And we do have a lot of Ben Jonson's library that we do know that he had access to.
He's an obsessive book collector. Yeah.
Yeah. Just because he came from the country, for Ben Jonson's case, it makes sense that he comes from the country, gets a ton of learning, and writes erudite plays.
And also, and I also just want to say, in terms of what Ben Jonson's right, like The Alchemist, which is his most famous work, is really fun, and it's about servants who are like subverting, their master leaves town because of the plague, and so they're like, aha, he's out of town, we're gonna go wild, and then they start running these like con schemes. Like, there is no Shakespeare play that focuses for the entire thing as like the protagonist is being like a bunch of wayward servants. Like, it's just a different perspective. And so, not to say that his biography determines what he writes. We're not saying that somebody not from an aristocratic background couldn't have been a wonderful playwright in the time of the Renaissance, just not that playwright. The Shakespeare guy was writing about court politics and hawking and all these gentlemanly pursuits, as you were saying.
Like we had said, when you go to like a university library, you go to the Shakespeare section, there's going to be, besides those biographies of William of Stratford, you're going to have Shakespeare and the law, Shakespeare and botany, Shakespeare and Italy. Like, it shows a vast array of knowledge. Also, English history, the point gets brought up a lot. Could Shakespeare have known some of this just by talking with other people, maybe accessing some noble's library? Shakespeare and the law is a huge one. There's a lot of literary legal wordplay in them. Around the same time that someone like Edward de Vere would have been in Gray's Inn, some of those cases are made fun of in the plays.
Gray's Inn being the law school. Yeah.
Yes. And then there's Shakespeare and botany, and Shakespeare and the sea, like nautical matters. People will go so far as to think whoever wrote Shakespeare must have been a sailor. He must have been a soldier. Right. He must have been a lawyer. So it would be difficult for someone like Shakespeare to gather that amount of information. Maybe not impossible, but it's a big question mark, I would say. But now if we go to de Vere's education, de Vere has a fantastic education starting from when he's 4 years old. De Vere, as far as we know, I think he was sent to live with a tutor when he was 4 years old, Sir Thomas Smith. And he was like one of the great minds of the time, apparently one of the great educators of the time. And he starts reading the classics from a young boy. And I believe de Vere was actually enrolled at Cambridge at age 8. So, and he has an array of tutors that move him through the classical languages. And as de Vere gets into his teenage years, he has one of his next tutors was Lawrence Noel. And Lawrence Noel, as I think we remember him now, as one of the first scholars who looked deeply into British history, British geography. And the other interesting thing that kind of touches into the access to books is that Lawrence Noel has the only copy of Beowulf in existence at the time. It's a manuscript in his possession. And many people think that the ending of Hamlet, where right from when Hamlet dies, another army is coming onto the castle. He tells a cousin to carry on his story. That's a reference to Beowulf, which it would be hard to get access to that.
I think there's many such cases, right? Like, I think that the primary source text for Macbeth, I think, was in the possession of somebody who he was like staying with or something.
He met her at a garden party. It was the mother of the husband of Mary Queen of Scots. She had the source text for Macbeth in her library. So many of those go through de Vere's life. We know that the main author that's associated with Shakespeare is Ovid. And the copy that people think the playwright must have almost memorized was Arthur Golding's translation of Ovid's Metamorphoses. Mm-hmm. Another revelation comes when Arthur Golding is de Vere's uncle. He's, I think, a half-brother of de Vere's mother. And he is living in the same house at the time he's doing the translation. And he's likely in charge of de Vere's education. That's another one of his tutors. Obviously, William Stratford could get this translation, but what a close connection. And it's in the plays constantly. So
Yeah.
De Vere does go to legal finishing school, and there's so many references to apothecaries making up herbal remedies. Sir Thomas Smith, if you look at De Vere's biography, Sir Thomas Smith is a very good pharmacist, a doctor, and he's constantly making these same sorts of herbal concoctions. So as you look into De Vere's education, even before he starts on his travels, I just think there's so much circumstantial evidence there.
Absolutely.
Hamlet and De Vere, a case study. One of the primary French source texts for Hamlet was in the Histoire Tragique by François de Belforest. It was published in the early 1570s and not translated into English until 1608, well after several quartos of Shakespeare's Hamlet had already been published. De Vere travels to France in the mid-1570s. He attends the coronation of King Henri II and makes extended stays in French aristocratic households. Many scholars have detected the influence of Beowulf on Shakespeare's Hamlet. In the Elizabethan era, there was a single manuscript copy of Beowulf in existence. It was in the possession of Lawrence Noel, one of De Vere's primary tutors. The character of Polonius is widely recognized as having been based on Elizabeth's chief advisor, William Cecil, Lord Burleigh. The advice that Polonius gives to his son Laertes is nearly identical to the advice William Cecil gives to his son Robert. These parental maxims of William Cecil were not published until 1616 as certain precepts. That is the same year as the death of William Shakespeare from Stratford. It would have been unlikely that many outside the family and close circle of William Cecil would have known of them. When De Vere's father died when he was 12, he lived at William Cecil's house as a ward of the crown. De Vere married William Cecil's daughter, Anne Cecil. Hamlet has a troubled relationship with Polonius's daughter, Ophelia. De Vere had a troubled marriage with William Cecil's daughter, Anne. Scholars have also noted that the to be or not to be soliloquy and several other passages in Hamlet closely parallel passages in the book of the Italian Renaissance mathematician and physician Girolamo Cardano, written about the consolations of philosophy. De Vere sponsors an English translation of this work in 1573, entitled Cardanus's Comfort, and writes a prefatory letter and a poem for the translation. In Act 4 of Hamlet, Hamlet surveys Fortinbras's troops and boards a ship that is attacked by pirates, who strip Hamlet and leave him naked on the shore. During De Vere's tour of France, De Vere is invited to survey the troops of the Duke of Casimir, and when he sails back to England, his ship is intercepted by pirates, and De Vere is stripped naked and left on the shore. Edward de Vere's brother-in-law, Peregrine Bertie, was sent by Queen Elizabeth to Denmark in 1582 on a diplomatic mission to the Danish king, Frederick II. In 1582 and 85, Peregrine Bertie spends a total of 5 months in the castle that Elsinore refers to. He visits the observatory of the astronomer Tycho Brahe. The supernova in the constellation of Cassiopeia that both Tycho Brahe and John Dee had famously observed is referenced in the play. Peregrine Bertie also writes of meeting Danish courtiers with the surnames Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. None of these points amount to conclusive proof that Edward de Vere was the author of Hamlet, but they point to the wealth of circumstantial evidence that links de Vere's life, his learning, and his travels to so many of the plays in the Shakespeare canon, from Othello to All's Well That Ends Well, from Love's Labour's Lost and Timon of Athens to A Winter's Tale and King Lear, only to name a few.
All right. Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about pseudonyms. So it was very common at this time to be writing under pseudonyms. It seems like there's contemporary historical records suggesting that many other noblemen were writing and that they were kind of suppressing it. I think to Elizabeth's credit, like she loved poetry, you know what I mean? Like that, I think that moved the needle in a way that it's hard to underestimate because it was a big vibe shift. She was King Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn's daughter. And I guess, Bloody Mary was into like burning heretics. And then Queen Elizabeth was really into poetry. And so then you get this amazing flowering of arts and culture. And I think that the climate in which it's kind of funny because they all had to pretend to be in love with her. Like that was sort of like the culture was just everybody had to write this courtly love poetry and sort of simp for Queen Elizabeth, which is funny because it's like before it's like everyone, if you're like a 14-year-old girl, you have to like, oh, here, like get thrown at like, Henry VIII, like hope it goes well. And then it's different now. But so, she has this close relationship with all these courtiers, with de Vere. There's letters. Her Mary Queen of Scots writes a letter, alluding to his very close relationship with Queen Elizabeth. So basically, there's this interesting thing where he gets paid £1,000 annuity a year, which is, I think, the highest salary of anyone in the government. And it's coming out of the budget of courts and revels. And so you were speaking earlier about cosmography and his interest in English history. And so there's a quote by Thomas Nash, which I would argue very strongly, but for another day, is another pseudonym of de Vere, talking about the policy of plays, which is basically this idea that it's the Spanish Armada. There's, instability around England. We want to make sure that people are feeling patriotic, that there's not, there's the papal, like the Pope has declared Elizabeth an illegitimate queen and said, if you're a loyal Catholic, you'll try and assassinate her. So there's a real need for some sort of like stirring propaganda to bring the country together. And so I think that it seems likely that the history plays were part of this propaganda campaign that de Vere was commissioned by the crown to orchestrate. And so just speaking more about pseudonyms at the time, it was very common, just like I like to make the joke, like, somebody's like AOL screen name, if there's a format that you can recognize it, it's not like their real name isn't, whatever, 35. So the fact that there's a hyphen, most of the early times that Shakespeare shows up in print in the 90s, it's like Shake-Spear. And that's highly notable because people would have known that that's a signal, just like your Twitter handle or whatever, there's a format for it. It means that it might be a pseudonym. For example, there's like Tom Truthtell, there's Martin Marr Prelate, there's, what is it, Cuthbury Curry Knave. So that's kind of a thing at the time. And a reason why almost every writer at the time wrote some things under a pseudonym was because we're not living in an era of free press. There's a really sad story about a guy who writes something that Queen Elizabeth found to be offensive, and he gets his hand cut off. And I think there's a story, it's kind of awful. It's like, I think he gets his hand cut off and then he says, God save the queen. And then he faints, which is like, I don't know, it's a lot. But anyway, so
it goes to the point that there is consequences to offending the government at the time. And a lot of the playwrights do get imprisoned for short periods of time or, have to flee for a while till.
Ben Jonson being one example of somebody who goes to jail over a play that he writes. And Oxford. So basically he was saying things, making fun of really powerful people and, airing a lot of dirty laundry in a way that if it had been another person, he would have absolutely been killed. Like there's not even a question, he was really crossing the line over and over again. And so, one has to ask, like, why does this guy have amnesty? Like what gives him permission? And so there's, it makes sense that it would be A, somebody writing under a pseudonym, and B, somebody who knew they had diplomatic immunity of some kind to, give them an allowance to push the envelope a little bit.
Yeah, that £1,000 annuity is an interesting point. It was a ton of money. And I think especially as Elizabeth's coming into her final years, she wasn't giving out a lot of money. That was one of the main problems the nobles had with her. And why they liked King James I is because she was like skinflint, like not giving up much largesse to her nobles at all. Yeah. And then de Vere gets £1,000 annuity, which was a lot of money. I think it's, equated to about $1 million. This gets paid out for his entire life.
Right.
And it gets paid out in the late 1580s, right as Spain is planning to attack England. And that's when the historical plays, that whole run of plays start to be played before the public, very patriotic. They start to look a lot like propaganda. So the coincidence of him getting that annuity, this idea of the policy of plays, and the historical plays starting to be toured around the country.
Yeah.
Another piece of circumstantial evidence that starts to make a lot of sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
labouring man that tills the fertile soil, and reaps the harvest fruit, hath not indeed the gain, but pain. And if for all his toil he gets the straw, the Lord will have the seed. The mason poor that builds the lordly halls dwells not in them, they are for high degree. His cottage is compact in paper walls, and not with brick or stone as others be. The idle drone that labours not at all sucks up the sweet of honey from the bee. Who worketh most, to their share least doth fall, with due desert reward will never be. So he that takes the pain to pen the book reaps not the gifts of goodly golden muse, but those gain who on the work shall look, and from the sour the sweet by skill doth choose. For he that beats the bush the bird not gets, but who sits still, and holdeth fast the nets.
There's a book that comes out in 1589 called The Art of English Posey. And basically he says there's many at court who are writing, but for whatever reason, don't put their names. They either publish anonymously or they put it out under other names. And he does mention de Vere later in that book as having done this, which also raises the point. De Vere is noted as a great poet and playwright during his life and well after his life. We have no record. Besides a few poems or maybe songs from his youth, we have nothing to say why people were saying it. He was such a great poet. Yeah. It does make you wonder, was he publishing under pseudonyms? And some of the people around him kind of half know.
Yeah, so there's some other quotes, people talking about Shakespeare in the 20s and 30s. So after both de Vere has died and also even the younger Will of Stratford has died, and Thomas Vicker in 1628 describes that famous writer who takes his name from shaking and spear, implying that Shakespeare was a pseudonym. And Richard Broman, 1638, describes Shakespeare as that English earl who loved to play and players so well. Yeah, these are further evidence that people at the time who were highly well connected and in kind of the courtly circles knew that this was
To the reader. This figure that thou here seest put, it was for gentle Shakespeare cut, wherein the graver had a strife with nature to outdo the life. O could he but have drawn his wit as well in brass as he hath hit his face, the print would then surpass all that was ever writ in brass. But since he cannot, reader, look not on his picture but his book.
So in an effort to get us out, I want to just plant a little bit of a seed with regards to, because it's all very speculative, but this idea. So for another time, there's a very strong case that de Vere was throughout his life very frequently publishing under pseudonyms, but also allonyms, which is to say that he would have a buddy who wasn't in the same position as, an aristocrat. And he would basically, play out under that buddy's name. And so there's something intriguing, and it does get a little confusing. Basically, Will of Stratford does show up, and there might have been some type of financial arrangement between him and de Vere. He gets really rich at the end of his life. Daniel, Ben Jonson, who seems to be, well, why don't you take it? I was going to say, can you introduce Ben Jonson?
Okay. I think for this discussion, which we didn't include much, I think Ben Jonson, he needs his own chapter. There's a lot of allusions to Shakespeare the writer. People have read his plays. There's not many allusions to people who knew Shakespeare personally, who mention him as a writer outside of Ben Jonson. But he speaks of him in a very confusing way. He writes poems about him that could go this way or could they go that way. There's too much to get into here with the material that's in the folio, which Ben Jonson writes poems for. He's the one that comes up with the phrase, Sweet Swan of Avon. He also comes up with phrases like the poet ape. Without getting into that, he seems to one that what might have known William Shakespeare of Stratford and had dealings with him and maybe included him in some of his plays. And I think Phoebe has a play that we can do a reading of.
Oh yeah, everyone is in for a treat. We are going to do this excerpt from the scene of Ben Jonson's Every Man Out of His Humor. So basically, just as context, the potential reading is there's a character called Sogliardo, who I'm going to invite you to consider is perhaps a portrayal by Jonson of Will of Stratford. And so in this scene, Sogliardo has just bought arms, like a coat of arms, which we know that Will of Stratford purchased a coat of arms. It probably cost about 30 pounds. More context of this. So Oxford had a coat of arms, which was a boar. So notice when a boar shows up, what's the not without mustard, Daniel?
I think the William of Stratford, his arms were not without right, written in French, but not without right was the motto in the coat of arms.
Right. Okay.
What part did you want me reading here?
So I guess there's Sogliardo, who is like the Shakespeare stand-in, and then there's Carlo and Puntarvolo. So I guess do you want to be the Shakespeare guy, or do you want to be the Carlo and Puntarvolo?
I'll be Carlo and Puntarvolo.
Okay, great. Okay. By this parchment, gentlemen, I have been so toiled among the heralds yonder, you will not believe. They do speak in the strangest language and give a man the hardest terms for his money that you ever knew.
But you have arms? Have you arms?
In faith, I thank them. I can write myself gentleman now. Here's my payment. It cost me 30 pounds by this breath.
A very fair coat, well charged and full of armory.
Nay, it has as much variety of colors in it as you have seen a coat have. How like you the crest, sir?
I understand it not well. What is it?
Marry, sir, it is your boar without a head, rampant. A boar without a head, that's very rare.
Aye, and rampant too. I troth I commend the herald's wit. He has deciphered him well. A swine without a head, without brain, without anything indeed, ramping to gentility.
Let the motto be, not without mustard. Okay, so yeah. So basically, I think we should leave it here. I think people can consider for themselves. There's so much more to go into, but I think there's something tantalizing about the idea that there was maybe this arrangement between de Vere with his boar coat of arms, paying Will of Stratford, and that perhaps this Ben Jonson play talks a little bit about what their real relationship was and how he started to, his name started to get erased. So, okay. Well, thank you very much. If you've made it through with us, we appreciate your time and consideration, and thanks for stopping by.
Thanks, Phoebe.
Thanks, Daniel.
Bye-bye.